This is Mary Page from Chicago, and welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia. Today, our guest is Olga Podoplelova, a human rights lawyer and head of the litigation department at Russia Behind Bars, a Russian nonprofit that works to protect prisoners' rights. Thank you for joining us, Olga.
Thank you for inviting, Mary.
We're looking forward to hearing your views that will help us better understand the environment for working on human rights issues in Russia. I have some questions to frame our interview, which we expect to take about 30 minutes. So if you're ready, let's get started. First, could you tell us something about your organization? I'm calling it Russia Behind Bars, but most people know it as Rus Sidyashaya. Right. When was it founded, and what are its main goals?
So Russia Behind Bars, or as you said, Rus Sidyashaya, was founded back in 2008 as a civil activists movement. And we were registered as a foundation 6 years ago. It was in 2015. We started as a movement of those people who either went through the prison themselves or had some relatives or friends who were criminally prosecuted. And that's why they have to dive into all those issues of imprisonment and learned some very useful information which could help others to deal with the problems they face during the imprisonment. At first, a lot of Russia Behind Bars Foundation's work was centered around some humanitarian aid to prisoners and their families. And after that, the team grew and we started to provide legal advice. We started to engage in advocacy and strategic litigation. And recently we also started psychological aid program. And one of our big projects is also so-called School of Public Defenders. So it's a school for those lawyers, human rights activists and relatives who are interested in helping during criminal trial, being aid to a lawyer representing a person.
Now, could you give some examples of successes that you've had? Are conditions in Russian prisons improving from your perspective?
Well, I actually hate to say, but I think that I haven't witnessed any positive shifts, like great positive shifts in penal policy in Russia and the state of Russian prisons. Although, of course, there are some victories which can be attributed to the nonprofit sector and our organization ourselves. For example, last month, the Council of Europe has published a report about prison statistics around Europe. And so there were there was a lot of information about Russia in comparison to other countries. And unfortunately, a lot of the statistics says that Russia is not doing a great job concerning penal policy. So although our prison population has been decreasing over the years, still the incarceration rate is the highest in Europe. And we have one of the biggest mortality rates in prisons concerning other countries, for example. So Russia is also a leader in suicides in prison. And we all know that there are very difficult problems with torture and access to healthcare in prisons. unfortunately, these issues are not easily tackled, and they cannot, I think, be addressed properly during the course of this time.
So could you talk a little bit about how, if at all, the law on foreign agents affects the Russia Behind Bars Foundation?
Yes, of course. So we were put on the list of foreign agents NGO back in 2017. And since then, of course, as any other organization on that list, we have to deal with a lot of administrative pressure and some political pressure from the government. And it's been hard to communicate with the government itself, with the penal service. They tend not to listen to advice and papers which we um, file in cases which we actually litigate or try to push through the penal agency.
Mhm. In general, how much community support do human rights organizations like yours have? And in other words, are there people in the communities where you are working who are supporters of prisoners' rights?
Well, I should say that there is a lot of stigma around prisoners and those people who went through imprisonment in Russia. And it actually starts at the time when a person first is detained, you know, and then after the release, he or she is facing very serious social problems. Like during imprisonment, a person often loses ties with the community and his friends and family. Uh, Such people sometimes lose housing. And of course, they have issues with finding jobs after release. So in that sense, I think that a lot of people still do not realize that the issue is not the prisoners, but the penal system itself, which kind of replicates crime, and it's not designed currently to resocialize people and try to uh, make them return as law-obedient citizens back to the society. So it's basically destroying people. But I think that currently we are facing a very unique time, I would say, because of the mass protests which happened over the course of a few years. And since there were mass arrests, a lot of people noticed in the media the poor situation which administrative detainees go through, and that's why the whole situation in prisons kind of is on the news right now, also because of Alexei Navalny, and it's good for public understanding to see what's happening inside of prisons. I think they get a lot of more information when they used to have, and now all the pressing issues such as prison healthcare, torture, they just continually being discussed on the media, and it's good.
Yes, good. Yes. So in the context of healthcare, what's the situation with protecting prisoners from COVID infections inside the prisons that you've been working with?
Well, we must say that our organization has a project where we monitor the situation with COVID in prisons, in Russian prisons. And unfortunately, we have to state that this problem was not handled very well by the penal agency. So people do not get proper diagnosis in time. They do not have any medicine being available to them. They do not have doctors who can visit them and help in some emergency situation. And of course, the prison administration actually hides the numbers. So they do not have relevant statistics being put online. And I think that the only way to know the real numbers is to compare the mortality rates in some nearest future when it's published, and to see what kind of numbers can be attached to the period which the COVID was active.
Mhm. Um, so thinking now about the activists that are working on prisoners' rights, are there any risks that you face as a human rights defender in Russia today? And if so, what are the risks?
Well, it's kind of a very difficult question to answer, because I think everyone who works in human rights sphere in Russia is kind of at risk of some kind of prosecution, attacks, harassment, and any sorts of bad things. Well, actually, like in our organization, of course, we have some attention towards our information security, and we try to keep our files safe. But I have to say that like frequently we experience some pressure from the Ministry of Justice, who comes up with several accusations which are actually false. And we also had accusation of making fakes about COVID, actually because of our project which we implement on monitoring the COVID in Russian prisons. So it's very hard to say where and how something bad can happen. But I think maybe you've heard that today our colleague Ivan Pavlov, who is a prominent Russian human rights defender who works on very sensitive cases with state secrets, was being charged with some ridiculous accusation. And so anything can happen to anyone pretty much. And we worked with Ivan Pavlov on several cases, and I know his colleagues very well. So we would like to wish that everything could be different with his situation.
Right. It, in general, the human rights situation in Russia is painted by the Western media as very bleak indeed. And I'm wondering, is it as bleak as the Western media tend to suggest?
Well, I believe that the situation with human rights in Russia has been very dangerously, I'd say, like decreasing in terms of respect for human rights. And we have a lot of issues with international law standards implementation in very different spheres. And I think that the situation is actually going to get even worse in the course of the next few months and years.
So you mentioned international law, and I'm wondering, sort of more generally, what impact the outside world has on human rights in Russia. Policies in the U.S., policies in the EU, and some of international tribunals, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question, because I think that the European system, for example, and especially the European Court of Human Rights, has influenced Russian law and legal policy in many different ways. And if we, for example, talk about prisons, since ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights, it's been some developments which I think can directly be attached to the work of the European Court of Human Rights, like the issue of overcrowding in Russian prisons. In some way, I think it's necessary to state that the conditions in prisons also get some attention from the government, although a lot needs to be done in this sphere. It's definitely better than in the 90s, but still we have a long way to go. Let's say there were issues with there are still issues with very far placement of prisoners mm, who can, for example, before trial leave in Moscow and they are sent to serve their sentence somewhere very far in Siberia, for example. And of course, their families cannot afford uh, the money it needs just to travel to visit their relative. And there were a few cases between the European Court of Human Rights, and just last year there was passed a law which actually prohibits the Federal Penitentiary Service to place prisoners in another region. Yes, but still, this is a good law, but it has really slow implementation because now the federal service the Federal Penitentiary Service has to move the prisoners, and it takes time, it takes money, which they pretend not to have, although they just allot it to some other um, some other needs which are not really important.
And does the Russia Behind Bars Foundation work at all on implementing some of the judgments from the European Court of Human Rights?
Yeah, we work, for example, in the coalition with the Human Rights Center Memorial, especially on this issue of placement of prisoners. And we have a few cases in Russian courts on this issue. We're trying to get people transferred from remote regions to somewhere close to their families.
How do you decide which cases to take up?
Well, it really depends on a few factors. First of all, we try to take cases which involve some policy issues, which have to have something with like interpretation of the law or making the law different, amending it, trying to make some change in the law on the policy. And sometimes we also have cases which we take because it would be not right not to take them. Like, for example, a few days ago, my colleagues won a case about wrongful criminal prosecution, and they managed to get some money for our client for that wrongful criminal prosecution. And such little victories, they help to see something that we can actually do, in the course of everything that's very difficult to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations
Thank you.
on that victory. And so a personal question here, what inspired you to become a human rights lawyer and to look particularly at the conditions of prisons?
I hope it's not too shameful to say that I actually entered law school because it was, I think, a good thing to do. And I always hated contracts and something boring like taxes. So I was very interested in constitutional law, and I was majoring in constitutional law. Back in 2012, I transferred from State University to Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And that's where I met great Russian lawyers, such as Mikhail Alexandrovich Krasnov, Ilya Georgievich Shablinsky, Elena Anatolievna Lukyanova, and I think they inspired me a lot to be engaged with constitutional law. And that's why I then took a path with government relations, and then I left for human rights, because it was a very interesting sphere for me to try to get my knowledge and experience too.
Is human rights law a popular course of study in law schools and at universities?
Well, I can't say it's generally popular, but a lot of universities, at least in Moscow, offer some courses on human rights and international law. A lot of students participate in moot courts, especially in JASEP and the moot courts on the European Court of Human Rights. And so I think that this sphere is getting some popularity. And I think a lot of new, young, very excited lawyers come even to our organization for internships. And one of them actually won a case just a few weeks ago, a case about a person participating in a public event when Navalny's sentence was transferred to a real one. So she got this prosecution stopped against her client. We are very proud of her.
Yes. Oh, that's great news. Yes. And it's good to hear that there are so many young people that are interested in pursuing this career. Looking ahead, sort of, what do you think the future holds for your work and for human rights in Russia in general?
Well, as I've said, I have the sense that over the next months and years, it will be a breakdown on human rights and for further shrinking of space for civil society participation, and a lot of political prosecutions. And I believe that we are facing very difficult times. But we are going to stand for our ideals in this time.
Yes. Well, that's great to hear. It's very inspirational to hear about your work and particularly about the successes. One by one, the court successes are going to add up to something. So I appreciate your time with us. I wish we had more time, but I think we're going to have to conclude. And I just want to thank you for this stimulating and enjoyable conversation and the opportunity to learn from your insights and your work, just what is going on in this very difficult area of human rights. Congratulations for making the progress that you're making, Olga.
Thank you, Mary.